Hugh Jackman, if you're listening to this, Logan and Deadpool? Maybe? Come on, call me, we'll make it happen. Welcome to the Crooked Tail Podcast. This is Rob, and I know it's been a while, as usual, but I'm trying to make something happen here. And this episode, we're mostly going to be talking about Logan, and I want to talk about a new format for these episodes going forward. Just something I want to throw out there and see if you guys respond to. But first, let's sort of catch up with some of the movies that I've seen since the last episode. So the last one I posted was right when the Oscar nominations were announced. Talked about La La Land. So I've seen a lot of stuff since then, but I'm mostly going to focus on the 2017 releases. I have a post up on the site now where you can read my favorite films of 2016, and I talk about Moonlight in there briefly. I will also put up a subsequent podcast episode talking about Moonlight a little more in depth, but we'll get to that. So for now, so far this year, I want to talk about specifically 3 newer releases that I've seen in the past few weeks, all of which were really strong, and all of which would probably get about 4 out of 5 from me. So far, 2017 is shaping up to be a really great year for movies. I also saw Split, and that was pretty solid. But these 3 really sort of have been like keeping the momentum rolling along. We have John Wick Chapter 2, which I thought was a really strong film, and I thought had a really fun expansion of that world. I know a lot of people have been saying that. That's sort of the big takeaway from that film, is it seems more of a transitional film in the John Wick, what would I guess end up being at least a trilogy. Whereas the first one's introducing the character and sort of has a self-contained story. The second one is sort of bridging out of that story, literally, with the opening sequence, and then expanding out into something much wider in scope, more focused on the mythology that John Wick is a part of than just a story of him, if that makes any sense. Sort of, instead of focusing in on a certain aspect of the story, sort of started in that micro level and then has been pulling back steadily to now we have a setup for John Wick Chapter 3 with a global scale. So I thought that was a hell of a lot of fun. I agree with a lot of the reviews that I've been hearing, where they're saying that the emotional motivation isn't as strong as the first film. I think the first film is probably, because of that, it's probably a better movie, but I think the second one is maybe somewhat more fun because it does sort of get to relish in the details of the assassins and the whole underground society with them, and the coins and all the whole thing. It's a blast, and I'm really excited for Chapter 3. And, I went to see it with Freddie and my dad, or our dad, and we pretty much all walked out of there being like, all right, we're ready for the next one. Let's do it. So it's just a real crowd-pleasing film, and I think sort of cements that franchise as probably the best American-made action film, or action series, rather, of the past 10 or 15 years, definitely at least the 2010s. I saw somebody on Twitter respond to me that maybe Fast and Furious, and I guess if we're talking about like financially, Fast and Furious is obviously up there, but if we're talking from a creative standpoint, I think John Wick is a little bit on another level than Fast and Furious. So also the Lego Batman movie, similar to John Wick, I actually feel like the predecessor to this one, the Lego movie itself, obviously, which was a huge phenomenon, and so many people love, and somehow didn't get nominated for Best Animated Feature that year, which is still sort of ridiculous. But I feel like that's probably a better movie, but I really liked the Lego Batman movie. It spoke to me as a Batman fan. I've talked on this podcast a million times about how much I love Batman, and the fact that this film touched on the decades of Batman movies and media that have preceded it, going all the way back to Adam West and to various versions of the comics, and depicting a lighter version of Batman than we've obviously got in Ben Affleck's portrayal. I thought that the film had a lot of fun with that and sort of demonstrated that The Dark Knight doesn't necessarily have to always be so dark. And the voice cast, of course, was great. Will Arnett, Michael Cera, Rosario Dawson, Zach Galifianakis. And I don't know, it was just a really fun romp that really still had a lot to say about the character and who he is. and just take a different approach to him. And it's really cool that Warner Brothers has gone from, we have Batman in the movies, he can't be on TV, when Smallville was going on, and now they have Superman in the movie, they have Superman on Supergirl, they have Batman on Gotham, sort of, not really, but they have Bruce Wayne on Gotham, they have Batman and Ben Affleck's Batman, and they also have now Lego Batman, and they're sort of embracing more of the multiverse approach to things that they've had in the comics forever, so it only stands to reason that would transfer into other media. And lastly, I want to talk about Get Out. This is the most recent of the three that I've seen, and this one I'm probably going to go in a little more detail on. This film, I was really excited to see it initially because I saw the trailer and it was really sort of stunning just out the gate, and I knew it had a lot of satirical elements going on with it, sort of a commentary on race relations, and I think that the film has outstanding performances by Daniel Kaluuya, Lil Rel Howery, and Betty Gabriel in particular. Kaluuya, of course, is the main character, and if you haven't seen this movie for some reason or haven't seen the trailer, he plays a black man who's going with his white girlfriend to meet her parents for the first time. And it sort of touches on the whole paranoia of, him feeling uncomfortable around all these white people, and do they see him differently, and what is going on in this suburban neighborhood where the few black people that he does see are acting very strange and just off, and it's the directorial debut by Jordan Peele of Key and Peele, who of course also was a writer on Keanu, which is the movie that him and Keegan-Michael Key were in last year, which was actually a really fun movie too. Get Out is a stronger film. It just has a much stronger vision throughout, and I feel like I need to see it maybe again to really kind of appreciate it, because it was really good, but it did sort of boil down to sort of an inventive, auspicious B-movie in a way. And I know that the subject matter is a lot deeper than that, and there is a lot of subtext going on with it. But I don't want to get into spoilers on that, but the ultimate reveal of what's going on in the town and all of that, I feel like is pretty easy to sort of, not 100% predict, because there's another element that's thrown in there later on where you're like, what, really? Come on now. But the idea of what they're going for, what they're doing, is sort of easy to read to some level up front, and maybe that's intentional. And you sort of watch the film thinking they're going to subvert those expectations, but then they just sort of deepen and expand them. But I actually had a thought halfway through the film, thinking it was going to go in a different direction that would have been, to me, even more complex. And I'd heard a lot before going into this film about how it was such a mind bender, and how the ending's going to blow you away and that kind of thing. And I do feel like the ending was very crowd pleasing. The way it ends is really exciting. But the ultimate reveal, I felt like, was slightly underserved, and the marketing, unfortunately, this is what you get for watching trailers nowadays. The marketing gave away quite a bit of the big twists. I don't want to, for those of you that haven't seen it, I don't really want to get into it, but I would definitely, if you haven't seen any trailers for this, I would just go check it out and give it a shot. It does focus pretty well balanced on the horror and the comedy aspect of it. And I mean comedy not as in like physical comedy, Evil Dead style, just satire and the social commentary and how what it has to say relates to our reality, I thought was really interesting. And like I said, it was a really strong film that I would probably appreciate more on subsequent viewings, just because I think I had gone in with inflated expectations a bit, just from everything I'd been hearing going into the theater. So that'll take us over into a more in-depth review of Logan.
We got ourselves an X-Men fan. Maybe a quarter of it happened, and not like this. In the real world, people die.
Logan.
I don't want to talk about it.
Logan.
Just stop.
Be careful.
Okay, so Logan is the 10th film in Fox's X-Men franchise, and it is presumably the last one for Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. So before we get into it, I just wanted to explain a little bit how I'm going to lay things out. First of all, I'm going to do a little brief intro. I guess I just did that actually, talking about the film, and then we're going to break it down into 5 different sections. We're going to talk about the hype. That is the pre-release discussion, rumors, blah, blah, blah. The story, the cast, the production itself, and then the verdict. My final thoughts on the film. So going into Logan, this film is James Mangold returning from the Wolverine, which he did in 2013, the last solo film for Hugh Jackman's interpretation of the classic Marvel character. There's a lot of rumors about this one beforehand. I mean, everybody was saying about, it's Hugh Jackman's hashtag one last time, and it may be going for an R rating, and whether or not that is influenced by Deadpool's success. Was it going for an R rating beforehand? Was it not? Some people say that it was, and that Mangold really wanted to return if he was going to be able to do his vision of this, and that did include an R rating. There was a lot of speculation regarding what the movie would cover. I heard rumors about Sabretooth coming into this at one point. And we can talk in a few minutes about exactly where he probably would have fit. About this being based on the Old Man Logan comic book, which it is sort of, but not really. And of course, where it fits within the famously convoluted timeline for the X-Men films to date. Of course, we had the original 3, and then you had the prequel Wolverine film. Then you had the reboot, but was sort of ended up being more of a prequel, and then X-Men Days of Future Past in 2014 reset the timeline, effectively wiping out the 2 weakest films from the franchise. So that's good. No more X-Men Origins Wolverine to worry about, and no more X-Men The Last Stand. So that's probably a good thing, all told. And what this means for the franchise now coming after Deadpool, and where does this leave the X-Men going into the multiple films that are currently in development. We have X-Force that's being talked about, of course, Deadpool 2 next year, as well as X-Men Supernova and X-Men The New Mutants. So, did this film kind of mark a return to the success and tone a little bit, not tone, but the success of Deadpool, and kind of course correct after X-Men Apocalypse, which was sort of not very well received critically and financially, probably one of the weakest entries in the franchise to date. So, let's get into the film in a little more detail. I will be talking spoilers, so from this point on, spoilers. Here's your spoiler warning, spoilers! For those of you who haven't seen Logan, and if you haven't seen Logan, why haven't you seen Logan? Again, even people that aren't huge fans of the X-Men film franchise or superhero films in general might find enjoyment in this. It's a little, not even a little. It's way outside the box when it comes to this genre, and we'll get into that a little bit. So as far as the story here is by James Mangold himself, screenplay by the director, Scott Frank, and the director being Mangold, Scott Frank, and Michael Green. Set in 2029, and the mutants now are largely extinct. There's no more X-Men, there's no more Brotherhood of Mutants. Presumably a lot of the characters that we've known in the past are either dead or gone, or presumed dead, or missing, or etc., etc. So Wolverine is caring for the ailing Professor Charles Xavier, Patrick Stewart back in the role, and then he finds himself drawn into something larger when a mysterious young girl with powers like his own emerges with malevolent forces in pursuit. Of course, you get that, and if you've seen any of the trailers, you get plenty of that with Professor X's, he's like you, she's like you, Logan, very much like you, and all of that. So the film could basically be said to fall in its own timeline, in that it is sort of a post-apocalyptic setting, and doesn't really rely necessarily on the events of the previous films. However, it does also sort of gel with pretty much everything we've seen to date. I would say probably not with The Last Stand, because that had some effects on the characters. Jean Grey's death at the hands of Logan, that had already been sort of ironed out in the Wolverine, and then basically retconned the next year in Days of Future Past. These films have sort of it's been a rough time. It's been a rough period for Fox's X-Men franchise to try and figure out what it wants to hone in on, where it wants to focus going forward, and exactly how to find its own niche within the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe, DC Extended Universe thing, with Fox's X-Men sort of being the stepchild of that warring Marvel versus DC thing. Even though these are based on Marvel characters, of course, this is not Marvel Studios' involvement whatsoever. So there's sort of been the pun intended X factor, I guess, in that whole comic book or superhero movie landscape. So this one, I would say, if you look at it, it really does kind of fit with the previous films. There's a lot of references to earlier films in the franchise, and I'll get into that in a bit. The tone basically implies that the other movies weren't the full story, or they were at least toned down versions of that story. You get a very meta plot point in which the X-Men comics play a pivotal role. Basically, and I think that you'll hear that in the clip that I just played from the trailer, that the X-Men, I guess, became legends and became kind of chronicled by writers who sort of spun their own adventures based on reports of the X-Men and that kind of thing. It does also, more than the X-Men, it does really position Logan himself as a legend. There's characters in the film that mention, I'm a big fan, and that a lot of people know who he is, even though at this point in the story he's pretty much laying low, working as a chauffeur and trying to take care of Professor X as essentially the last remaining follower of his, or student of his, sort of. It does a good job of weaving in not only Jackman's long history in the role, but the 17 years that we've spent watching films with him play Wolverine. He has appeared in 9 out of the 10 films, with the only exception being Deadpool, and even then Wolverine is referenced several times, and you even see Hugh Jackman's face stapled onto Deadpool's at one point. And I think the weight of all that history for both the character and the audience does really come to bear in this one, in an interesting and surprising way. So the filmmakers have acknowledged that this is loosely inspired by Old Man Logan, but in a lot of ways it really is more of an Unforgiven style superhero film, in that it's this aging badass coming out of retirement to one last hurrah. And in that way, it sort of also functions as kind of a Dark Knight Returns for Wolverine, just thematically, and as far as wrapping up his story, his character, his legacy. And in that respect, if this is the last time we get Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, it's really a hell of a send-off. Wolverine in this film is really taken off the leash for the first time in any of the movies to date. And I want to stress, those of you who have kids and they're really into superheroes and they love the X-Men and blah blah blah, I would advise you not to bring your kids to this. There's not only constant F-bombs, there's a lot of violence. They even sneak a pair of breasts into the film. Just not that that's necessarily the biggest bone of contention in the film, but the fact that there are slit throats, there are adamantium claws going through heads quite a bit, there are limbs that are straight up chopped off, and you guys thought BVS was dark and gritty. I just, from my own experience, there was I think a 6 or 7 year old child in the theater when Kai and I went to see this recently, and they actually left halfway through the movie. The little boy and the adult that he was with and I don't think they came back in. And I hope that they didn't, because I was even saying Kai before the movie. I'm like, yeah, this kid should not fucking be in here. This is not a movie for this child. They just see, oh, it's a superhero, and they just go for it. And I think going forward, parents of small children, of now I am one, of which I now am, I think are going to have to be a lot more well-informed and educated on the films themselves, because we will probably get an increasing variety of superhero and comic book films going forward, and I hope that that's the case. As long as it's appropriate for the character, I think this kind of approach is a good one. And Wolverine is definitely a dark and violent enough character that this sort of over-the-top violence really does, cut to the heart of who he is. So let's go talk about the cast now for a little bit. Now, this is a very character-focused film. You'll notice at in the story section up front, I didn't really spend a whole lot of time going over the story. I'm not going to recap it for you, because my goal here is not to tell you, okay, this is what happened. Act 1, this happens. Act 2 happens here. And Act 3, this is where it ends up. I'm here to tell you my thoughts on it. And, as a supplementary material for you to see it. I'm still urging you to see the film. So, and the reason I didn't talk about the story that much up front, other than trying to spare you the plot details so you can actually go see the film yourself, is that this is a very character-focused film. It's largely a road film. It's largely a Western in a lot of ways. And it does sort of hew back to a lot of archetypal story elements that you would associate with those genres. It's really much more of a character study than a plot-driven film. I mean, there's really only 5 or 6 characters who get any kind of significant screen time. And I mean significant as in they're in multiple acts of the film. They play an active role in the story itself, and less, I'm not talking so much about Eric LaSalle and Elise Neal and more transient characters like that, or the actress who plays Gabriella up front in Act 1. I'm talking about the main people that we actually get to know in any way, shape, or form. The film's a lot less concerned with the mythology than it is about exploring Wolverine and Professor X and the new character here, the new addition, X-23, way more than developing, setting up another film or tying up loose ends like Days of Future Past sort of tried to knit it all together, even though it didn't really tie up loose ends. It kind of raised a whole other set of questions. But so let's go through the main 3 here up front. So obviously Hugh Jackman. This is 9 appearances in, including 2 basically cameos in First Class and Apocalypse. So it's no surprise here that Jackman is stellar in the role. But he at this point, he could probably play Wolverine in his sleep. But Mangold's film really allows him to delve a lot deeper into Logan than any of his previous films to date. I mean, he's usually been in an ensemble role or relegated with really subpar material in the case of X-Men Origins. Whereas the Wolverine was sort of, I think, our first hint at what Mangold and Jackman could do with this character, kind of taking him in a little bit of a more introspective direction, and basically laying out that he is in some ways sort of has a death wish. He doesn't really want to be a hero. He doesn't really want to go on much longer without in that film Jean Grey, in this film essentially everyone, and in a lot of ways Logan does feel like an extension of the themes that were laid out in the Wolverine. I actually saw something online yesterday, I believe, talking about how Yukio's prediction about Wolverine's death, that he would be laying on his back, blood splattered everywhere, holding his heart in his hand. And of course, spoilers, this film ends with Wolverine's death, holding his genetic daughter's hand, basically implying his heart, his love, his last true connection on Earth, before he went on to that other plane of existence. And whether or not Mangold set that up beforehand. And Mangold responded and said, well done, basically sort of acknowledging that, that maybe we were trying to sort of expound upon what we had done in the Wolverine. And I think there's a lot of a lot of ways in which this film sort of fits with that one as a companion piece, and we can sort of look at the Wolverine solo thing as a 2-volume set and kind of disregard X-Men Origins, since the franchise itself has essentially done so already anyway. There's just so much this film delves into as far as who Logan is, who Wolverine is, and it's safe to say that this is Jackman's best work as Wolverine by far. There's a lot of layers to him, both as a hero, as a man, and the film takes a lot of time to peel them back little by little and give us his rage, his loyalty to Professor X, the beast within, as well as like his softer side that we've seen hints of in the past with Jean Grey and in Rogue. And this is a character who's been through some real shit. He's dealing with all kinds of survivor's guilt and sort of the rationale behind his mindset and holding on to that adamantium bullet, which I believe was a reference back to X-Men Origins Wolverine. It's really interesting how Logan has taken basically the only elements of X-Men Origins Wolverine that worked, or in this case, and even an element that didn't work, and make it fit the storyline at hand and make it seem not ridiculous and terrible like it was in that film. And you really get the rationale behind his mindset for holding on to that bullet and for basically being suicidal. And, he at this point in his older age, he's dealing with, it sounds like adamantium poisoning his system. So he's sort of already dying, not quite as obviously as Professor X is, but he's decaying inside in his own way, and you can sort of tell that on his face. I mean, Hugh Jackman does not look nearly as aged as he does in this film, and the movie goes a long way to show that he is sort of on his last legs, and not quite as virile as he once was. And of course, that's expounded on even further with X-24, with Jackman playing a dual role here. And to be honest, that part of it was interesting, and I've heard some people say that, that it was on the nose but effective in that Wolverine is essentially battling a younger version of himself. I sort of saw that was actually a drawback for me. The whole, the classic hero facing his evil twin type of conceit. I feel like we've seen that way too many times, and this probably would have been where Sabretooth would have gone into it. And in a way, I would have liked to have seen them recruit Sabretooth for that role of facing off against Logan, and sort of bring that full circle, give Liev Schreiber a chance to play that character in a movie that's not awful, and sort of, because Sabretooth was such a key part of Logan's backstory in the films, well, at least in a couple of the films. And I would have liked to, I think that was a missed opportunity. Maybe they couldn't get Liev Schreiber, maybe they just didn't want to have any reference back to that movie than they already had. It's a tricky thing, but as far as Logan himself, I feel like Jackman totally nailed exactly what that character is going through. All the callbacks to his different character elements from all the films I mentioned about the bullet from Origins. There's the samurai sword from the Wolverine that you see in the background at one point. Even little things like, he has a battle with X-24 and he's trying to basically take his head off. That reminded me of Origins, where he's saying, it's funny how I said how they wiped out Origins, but they kind of salvaged a lot of little morsels from Origins in this film and put them to good use. He's ready to take his head off, and it made me think about that scene in Origins where he's like talking about threatening to kill Sabretooth and how are you gonna do that? I'll take your fucking head off, or I'll take your head off, see if that works. And I feel like that was sort of a visual callback to that. I've heard some Oscar buzz about Jackman in this film, and yes, he's been nominated before, but that was for Les Miserables, which is a much more Academy-friendly film. And as much as I'd love to see that Logan end up a Best Picture nominee next year, possibly with nominations for either Jackman or Stewart, and we'll get to him in a moment, I gotta say it's probably not going to happen, just because the Academy has such a bias when it comes to this genre. So moving on to Stewart, of course, Patrick Stewart's been playing this character nearly as much as Jackman has. I mean, I think he's been in about let's see, about 6 of the 9 X-Men or X-Men Wolverine films, with a cameo in Origins, as well as the role in Days of Future Past, and now here. I think just like Wolverine, we see a totally different side to Professor X, completely unbridled. I mean, he's suffering from a degenerative brain disease, and he's just totally bereft of the not totally bereft, but he has basically a sliver of the optimism and hope, and the leader that we once saw in the films is barely there. I mean, he still believes in Logan, and he still is trying to do what's right, but it's now clouded by the fact that he could barely function himself. And by the way, the sequences involving his seizures and the havoc that they wreak on the people around him was pretty extraordinary. And I thought were some of the most well-crafted sequences in the film. You get a couple of them, the main one being in the hotel, of course, where Wolverine has to take advantage of the fact that he can heal and sort of struggle through what would normally freeze most people. And I thought that the torment and emotional frailty that Stewart brought to this film was really powerful and like heartbreaking in a lot of ways. I mean, even early on, in his first couple scenes with Wolverine, in that silo, I guess, it's sort of on its side. It's like a giant tank that Wolverine is keeping him in to protect everyone from his mind and the havoc that it can wreak. No pun, not intended for havoc, since he was in the last film, but I thought he really captured that, and it really made a big emotional impact on me, someone who's been a fan of these characters since childhood, and who was really excited when they cast Patrick Stewart in this role 17 years ago. And I remember having fan casting the Ultimate X-Men film based on all my trading cards and that I had as a kid, and watching the show on Fox and being like, oh well, Patrick Stewart would be the perfect actor to play Professor X. Even then, and this is the early 90s, when he was basically just Jean-Luc Picard, was what he was mainly known for. And of course it was mainly the bald thing there, but he really brings such presence and authority to the role of Professor X here, that to see that so stripped away, I thought was really heart-wrenching. And of course, we don't find out until late in the film that his condition is what led to the death of the X-Men and what is known as the Westchester incident. And I thought that was an interesting twist on, if you know anything about the comic books, there's a plot element there in which Logan himself was mind-controlled by Mysterio, who of course is a Spider-Man character, and that opens up a whole other set of can of worms, and that you can't use any of the Spider-Man characters because they're owned by Sony. And I thought that was a smart move to sort of shift it over and turn Professor X into the one that needed help, needed protection, needed guidance, and Logan into his protector, which was sort of a theme that they kind of toyed with a little bit in Days of Future Past with with Logan going back in time to help the 1970s Professor X dealing with addiction and to help him sort of find his path. I feel like this film sort of builds on that theme and that sort of mentor-mentee, father-son relationship between Logan and Wolverine, that other than Xavier's relationship to Magneto, this is probably the other most central dynamic of the entire franchise to date, since it has carried on through so many of the films. As I mentioned, Patrick Stewart has been in 6 of them, and it's no surprise that those pretty much all involve Wolverine as well. So it's just, seeing Professor X at this late stage of his life was really interesting, and something that does feel sort of like an alt version of the character in some ways. But I mean, again, they've been through so much at this point, and his mind is barely hanging on. So it makes a lot of sense that he would be vastly different than, the Professor Xavier we met in 2000 when he recruited Wolverine into the X-Men and that whole thing. And the film actually references his discovery of Wolverine. He's like, when I found you, you were a cage fighter, and talks about New York on top of the Statue of Liberty. And it's just crazy to see this movie 17 years later and remembering, oh my God, that's right, that is what happened, and sort of kind of tracing the whole journey. This film in a lot of ways does feel like a concluding chapter for both of the characters, and in many ways I sort of think that it should kind of be the swan song for both of them, even though who knows where we're going forward. We could always have James McAvoy in the role of Xavier and that kind of thing. But I thought this film beautifully captured the relationship between Wolverine and Professor X. And, Stewart himself, like Jackman has said, he won't be back. And, this is the perfect finale, he says. And, I'm inclined to agree, whether or not that ends up being the case. So let's move on to our third lead, in Daphne Keane. She's playing Laura here, who is basically X-23. And my God, what a revelation this actress was. She owns every second she's on screen. And she doesn't even talk for most of her screen time here. But right from, her first moment, she has a similar, quiet intensity and sort of ferocity that Wolverine has, and with an underpinning of the same sense of pain and a search for belonging. In a lot of ways, as Professor X points out, her arc is very similar to Logan's, and I feel like I really want to see that expanded on going forward. I mean, this is Daphne Keane's first film, and she had an incredible presence. I know some of the fight scenes was probably stunt people and that kind of thing, but the fight scenes involving this character were so visceral and engaging, and she was easily one of the standout characters in the film, and that's putting her side by side with Professor X and Wolverine, who are two of the big, like I said earlier, along with Magneto, two of the three main pillars that this franchise has stood on for 17 years, and she stood toe to toe with them, and more than held her own, acting wise with the character that she was dealing with, as well as just as a sheer badass, and the evolution that she goes throughout the film was really fascinating, and you sort of see her from this almost feral beast evolve into a much more human character, and that's really punctuated by her by her cries of daddy at the end to Wolverine during his death. And that was so powerful and evocative of everything that she's experienced up to that point, and especially with me having a 3-month-old daughter at home. It's just that whole daddy moment and the father-daughter thing with the two of them. It's like, oh my God. I like many other people, I was very emotional at that point, but I still looked around, and there was a man sitting next to me, and I looked over to him, and he looked like he was having a little bit of an emotional moment too. So the fact that so many people have such a deep connection with that relationship between Laura and Logan, I thought was really powerful. And I know in the comic books, she picks up the mantle of Wolverine, actually just takes on the name going forward, and I really hope that they keep that going, into the subsequent films. The connection that she had with Logan was so strong here. Is brief, and she loses it pretty fast, but I mean, you could tell that having Logan in her life was such a turning point for her in a lot of ways. And, she had this lingering search for meaning, just like Logan in the original film, who had lost his memory and looking for a family, looking for somewhere to belong and some purpose. And you really can tell with Daphne Keane's performance here that she could feel that going forward. The character's behavior should reflect that last moment with Wolverine and him telling her, "Don't be what they made you," which not only is a broad theme that's been touched on in all kinds of films, even within the genre. I mean, you go back to Hellboy and that kind of thing, where he's essentially supposed to be the bringer of apocalypse, of the end of the world, and chooses a different path, and that you always have a choice. And that's not a new theme, but it's explored so well and so beautifully in this film, that I really hope that X-23 can sort of keep that thematic element alive in the future X-Men films. And there's been a lot of talk about X-23 and how she's going to factor into the movies that I mentioned that they have in development, maybe X-Factor, not X-Factor, we'll get there at some point, X-Force, or New Mutants, or one of those, whoever. We don't know exactly where we'll see her next, if they will just straight up do an X-23 movie. But honestly, I really hope that they resist the urge to recast and keep Daphne Keane in this role, sort of allow her to grow with it, just as Jackman did, so that 15, 20 years from now, when she's like, this is it, hashtag one last time as X-23, we can have a similar experience, kind of looking back at the long history that character has cultivated over multiple films. I know the actress is probably about 11 or 12, and it's not clear exactly what age they want X-23 to be when we next see her, but I'm perfectly fine with them kind of putting that character on the slight back burner for a little bit to focus on X-Force and Deadpool, and I guess the Gambit movie that's probably still happening. I mean, if it does, I'll see it, of course, because I'm so in the bag on anything relating to these films. But I'm not like clamoring for a Gambit film. I don't think anybody really is. But and then come back to X-23 when Keane is like late teens, then have her be a sort of the young adult, sort of Katniss Everdeen of the X-Men, I guess. So those are the three leads, and they were all incredibly powerful performances, and I really hope to see Jackman and or Stewart and or Keane. I mean, probably not the latter, just because her role is so quiet for so long in the film, and it's going to be hard enough for established actors like Jackman and Stewart to break into the awards buzz, let alone a newcomer like Keane. But I think she will get a shit ton of young star or young artist or whatever awards there are for young up-and-coming actors. She definitely deserves to get her share of recognition with that. But I'd love to see some Oscar buzz for acting, if nothing else, for these films going forward, in Oscars or Golden Globes or whatever. So as far as the other cast, we had Boyd Holbrook, and he has Pierce, and he was sort of the henchman-y type throughout the film, and he was effective, though unremarkable, and that's not the actor's fault. That's just the character that he was playing was sort of a one-note type of character, and I think he did bring the presence to that he, as much presence to it as we could hope. Stephen Merchant, who's really weird because I just saw him in the movie Table 19, which you can, by this way, read my review of on WeGotThisCovered.com. But he just played in that movie, and as his normally like scrawny, tall, lanky, like comedian doing his dry humor that he normally does. So to see him in a more serious role as Caliban, who of course factored into X-Men Apocalypse, but is way more fascinating and interesting here, and he gets some really strong moments to shine as well. I thought he did pretty well with that role. And then Richard E. Grant as the villain, Dr. Rice, towards the end. Again, not particularly useful, but like I said, this film, I mean, he was fine, but this film is not a movie about the villains. It's not a movie about building up the plot. This is more about the characters themselves, the three that I mentioned, and it does that so well that I can ignore the fact that it sort of falls into the Marvel Studios trap of having subpar villains and having a lot of exposition-heavy scenes, that kind of thing. So overall, three remarkable performances. Now moving forward into the production. So this film was gorgeously shot by the director of photography, John Matheson. I mean, there's a lot of... The color palette has a lot of orangey and a lot of yellow, a lot of dark blues, a lot of very somber tone, which fits the very bleak subject matter and the very heavy atmosphere of the movie itself. Sort of kind of fitting within the Western element that this film so heavily leans on. I thought the score by Marco Beltrami, who's done a lot of comic book films, such as I think he did the first Hellboy, one of the other Hellboys, and then I think he did some of the Blade movies. He's basically done a lot of these films in the past, and I thought he brought something really haunting and sort of different here that befits the fact that this is such a unique take on the comic book source material. Mangold's direction, of course, is on point. I mean, he's done this a million times. I actually just reviewed in IMDb, just like kind of looked over his filmography, and I forgot that he had done so many really strong films. I mean, I knew that he had done 3:10 to Yuma, but I forgot that he had also done Copland and a few other ones. I'm blanking here. Walk the Line, of course. Let me see exactly what he had. But he's done such interesting films in the past. Night and Day, which is not a great movie, but is sufficient and solid. Identity, which made an impression on me about a decade or so ago. Girl Interrupted. I mean, he's done all kinds of films. The only one of which I haven't seen is Heavy, his debut from 1995. But other than that, he's done such solid and interesting work across a broad spectrum of genres. But the fact that he had done 3:10 to Yuma, I think, really helped with the Western aesthetic here. But coming off of the Wolverine, I feel like he took his game to he took his whole game up a level here. I don't want to say a whole nother level, because those of you who might listen to the Film Spotting podcast, I know they are known for saying that a little too much. So I don't want to fall into the same trap, even though, if I'm gonna end up in a category with those guys, with Adam and Josh, I would love that, because their show's amazing. But so Logan's very much a Western take on the superhero genre, in much the same way that The Dark Knight is a crime thriller that just how happens to have a guy in a bat costume and another guy that dresses like a clown with makeup and such. And I feel like the production design here really supports the level of commitment that Mangold was trying to put into taking the superhero genre, and as he points out, and this is a good point, the superhero genre isn't even really a genre. It's a mode of storytelling that you can then take into different genre territory. I mean, we're seeing that with Marvel, with Doctor Strange being sort of this mystical thing, and Winter Soldier being like a political thriller, and Guardians of the Galaxy being a space opera, and now, this isn't Marvel Studios, of course, but Logan is kind of continuing that trend that Marvel has sort of laid out, even though Marvel's films do feel a little homogenized, and this is something that I mentioned in my Iron Fist review for the TV side of the Marvel universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. On We Got This Covered, you can read my review of Iron Fist over there. I feel like Logan is really keeping the Fox X-Men side of things really on the cutting edge and innovative, in that they're doing things that none of the other studios or shared universes are doing. And the visual effects in Logan, of course, are top-notch, and it's really a testament to the fact that these superhero films don't need to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, reportedly, the budget for Logan was $97 million, and that is hardly cheap. But when you compare that to rumors that Avengers Infinity War and Avengers 4 are going to combine to cost $1 billion, that's $500 million a piece, the fact that this is 97, it's like, that's low to mid-budget, considering similar films out there right now. And you can tell throughout Logan that there is a singular vision at play. This is Mangold and Jackman's baby, and you can tell that there's so much passion involved in this film. And despite some middle act sluggishness, and as I mentioned a few moments ago, sort of some exposition heavy scenes where there's a video that Logan sees on the dead nurse's phone that's sort of been like, this is what's happening, this is where this girl came from, here's all the footage you need to know, she's your baby. Some of those little narrative shortcuts I can forgive. Even the X-24 evil twin thing I can forgive, when the production level, the performances, the themes, the reverence and also non-reverence, not irreverence, there's a different term, the reverence to the previous to the previous films, the history it has, but also the brashness to go off and take that in a totally different direction and add exciting new layers to that. I think you can. It's easy to overlook the flaws within the film. So that being said, in case you didn't tell, I really loved Logan. So going into the verdict, this really goes to show you what happens when Fox gets out of a filmmaker's way and lets the director and a star tell their story. I mean, they did this with Ryan Reynolds and Tim Miller on Deadpool, and that turned out really well. The highest-grossing X-Men film in history, and I think also the least expensive to make. And of course, that's not necessarily saying that all superhero films need to be R-rated. I mean, for example, can you imagine an R-rated Spider-Man or even Superman? We don't really need that. Because or Captain America, those heroes are about something very different. They're about optimism and human nature, a sense of human good and a belief in the human spirit and all that. Characters like Deadpool, who doesn't give a fuck about any of that and just kind of does what he needs to do, cursing and slicing people wherever he needs to, all he wants. Wolverine, who is essentially an anti-hero in this film especially, but in general in the comics, he is a hero, but he goes way too far in order to enact justice or vengeance or whatever. And also Batman, just not necessarily because of Batman, but his rogues gallery and how dark that gets. Some of those characters are really befitting of an R rating in this kind of dire tone. And the film shouldn't be designed around what the movie should be rated. Of course, I'm speaking from the creative, artistic side of things, not the business side of things. I understand the PG-13 appeals to a wider audience, and then people can bring kids, and people can get in there without IDs and all that stuff. But you need to really do what befits the character. So for Wolverine, an R rating makes a lot of sense because of his dark nature, because of his history, because of his willingness to kill when necessary. And I think that it was a kind of a brilliant brilliant mode to take this character out. I was trying to find my words. Brilliant mode to take this character out on to kind of unleash the true Wolverine and really truly do justice to the character and who he is at his heart before we sort of say goodbye to him for a little while and move on to another era of the character, whether that's X-23 suited up as Wolverine or Logan rebooted somewhere down the line. I feel like that this film did a really good job kind of putting their stamp on that. In that way, it really does kind of function as a standalone, even though, it's a self-contained story about the true Wolverine from the comics, if you want to look at it that way, as referenced in the film itself. And it's really, to me, though, far more effective as an epilogue to Wolverine's story over these past 9 films. I mean, you had time travel and all kinds of stuff going on. But either way, regardless as you look at it, if you hate the X-Men films to date and you look at this as a standalone movie about Wolverine because you really like the character Wolverine and he's never been done right on screen, damn it, or you love the X-Men films and you just really want to see how they tie together his storyline in the conclusion for Hugh Jackman's run in this character, the conclusion of the Wolverine, I guess, putting this in quotes, trilogy, since they're all sort of disconnected in a way in different timelines and such. It is a film that transcends the genre to emerge as clearly one of the best comic book films in recent years. I know some people on some of the podcasts I've listened to have said that it's their favorite superhero film of all time. I don't know if I can quite go that far. It's definitely in the conversation, though. And, for me, it's if not the best X-Men film, it's up there with X2, X-Men United, and X-Men Days of Future Past. I know that latter one is really contentious, and some people love Days of Future Past, and some people can't stand it. But I think it was really ambitious in what it set out to do, and I think it did a good job sort of combining the two eras in a way that made sense, and had an interesting point for those characters in that story. So I have to really kind of hats off. I already have my hat off, so I'll put my hat back on so I can take the hat off. hats off, there you go, to Fox on their X-Men franchise. They really seem like they've sort of found their groove here and found that middle ground between the dark, somber tone that the DC extended universe is trying to go for, and the more interconnectedness of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where they're sort of connecting things, but they're not being slavish with it, and they're taking risks and taking their characters into R-rated territory, into different genres, and mixing it up. I just hope that going forward they can kind of keep that going, keep that momentum running strong with New Mutants, with Deadpool 2, with Gambit, X-Force. I don't know any of the other ones they have going. I have to say, though, everything sounds like Supernova, if that's what they're going to actually call the final film, or if they're going to change it. That looks like it's going to do the Dark Phoenix saga. As much as I would love to see that story done right on screen, it sort of feels like it's too little too late at this point. I mean, we did have that sort of keyed up in X2 X-Men United, and then massively fucked up in X-Men The Last Stand, and then keyed up again, I guess, in X-Men Apocalypse. And part of me wants to see one more, maybe, with that cast, with Sophie Turner, Ty Sheridan, Cody Smith-McPhee, and some of the other actors there, maybe even McAvoy back, to actually get that right. But I sort of feel like if Deadpool and Logan are the brave new world of the X-Men franchise and X-Men Apocalypse, which a lot of people disliked, and I like it enough. Like, it's decent. I think it's a decent end of that trilogy, but it's not overall. It's not very. If we're being totally objective, and I'm not thinking as a X-Men fan, it's not a particularly strong movie. There's a lot of weak story elements there. I don't like what they did with Mystique and all the other things. So if Supernova is going to be an extension of that, I kind of rather they leave the First Class trilogy and let that be a self-contained trilogy in and of itself, in the way that the X-Men X2 and Last Stand trilogy sort of stands alone. I sort of wish that Supernova wasn't happening. It's kind of, to me, a bad sign of what they're trying to do. It seems like it's more of the same. And at this point, and I've written about this, I wrote an article on cheatsheet.com about this that I'll include in the show notes on crookedtable.com for this. Basically saying that I think Deadpool should be the beginning of a reboot of the franchise. A lot of people have been saying, oh, they should reboot this, they should give it back to Marvel or whatever. And, whether they cross it over with Marvel or not, or they, maybe Fox comes to some kind of deal with Marvel the way that Sony has to be a part of that world, but it's not like not 100% like consumed by it. That would be perfect for me. But I do think that there's too much baggage right now for them to carry that into any kind of collaboration with Marvel or anything. I do feel like we have 10 films, and 3 of them pretty neatly fit into self-contained trilogies or thematic trilogies or character-based trilogies, what have you. You have the First Class movies that are very clearly prequels, with a little time travel thrown in, focusing on McAvoy, Fassbender, Lawrence, and Holt. And I think that is nice and contained, and the end of Apocalypse sort of teases into the Jean Grey, Storm, Cyclops cast that we have in the original X-Men trilogy. That storyline ends in Last Stand, and then we have the Wolverines that sort of weave throughout those other two timelines and such. And I don't think we need to have an extension of any of those 3. I'd like to see them all sort of put to bed, especially since this, Jackman is basically the poster boy for the franchise at this point, the most recognized star and the most popular character. So it seems like as good a time as any to start fresh. And I feel like Deadpool has only established, he's made references to McAvoy and Stewart, but he's fourth wall breaking, so he can kind of do whatever the hell he wants with that. The only X-Men that we've seen on screen are Colossus and Negasonic Teenage Warhead. That's hard to say. Negasonic Teenage Warhead. So I feel like that movie is the perfect seed to then build out your X-Forces, your Deadpool 2s. And if you want to do New Mutants, if you want to do more with Jean Grey, Cyclops, Wolverine, or X-23, whatever, that's where you go with it. You start fresh with Deadpool, Colossus, and Negasonic Teenage Warhead, as the only 3 established X-Men, and then you expand it out from there. So that's what I'm hoping to see for the franchise going forward. I think as far as Logan, I think this was a tremendous achievement for the franchise. One of the best X-Men films to date, definitely by several miles, the best Wolverine film. So I'm gonna go ahead and give it a 4.5 out of 5. Like I said, there was some middle act stuff going on that was a little slow, and there were some elements, exposition heavy and X-24, that kind of stuff, that did sort of bug me enough to pull it back from a 5 out of 5. But this is hands down one, head and shoulders, if not slightly better than X2 and Days of Future Past. Since I've seen those other two several times and I've only seen Logan once, I'd have to reflect and rewatch to kind of give my full thoughts on that. But that's where I stand so far. So anyway, that concludes my in-depth review of Logan. Let me know what you think of this new format, the sort of breaking it down and honing in on one particular film in greater detail, rather than sort of be like, here's my review of this, here's my review of this, like I've done that in the past. But I feel like this might be a little bit of a better way of doing the podcast, so I can kind of have it provide better content for you, more in-depth thoughts on a film, and sort of elaborate on some points that I would otherwise just skirt over, rather than just give you a surface level, it was really cool, this part, and this guy, and yeah, check it out. Rather than just do that, I can kind of get in depth on plot details and elements of the film that really impressed or disappointed me, with sort of a catching up, quick hits type of grab bag type of segment in the beginning, where you'd be like, I saw this, and this, that's all cool, and now our feature presentation, if you will, and have Logan be the feature presentation in this episode, and then a different film each time. So I might try and do that going forward. As I mentioned, if you want to read my article about Deadpool, how that should kick off a reboot of the X-Men franchise, if you want to read my review of the Wolverine, the previous Mangold Jackman film in this franchise that I wrote for crookedtable.com now 4 years ago, wow. You want to see my thoughts on Days of Future Past, and that was actually in my best of 2014, or if you want to just see other franchises like the X-Men that I will follow anywhere, I will have links to those in the show notes. Going forward, I think the next one I'm planning on these is I want to go sort of do a deep dive into Moonlight. As you guys know, I had an episode two episodes, last episode if you're listening to this, talking about La La Land and sharing my thoughts on that, and that didn't even win Best Picture, and I want to let you guys know exactly how I feel about La La Land losing to Moonlight, my thoughts on Moonlight, my thoughts on the Best Picture kerfuffle, which is not a word I often get to use, so I'm gonna enjoy using it here, and break that film down in greater depth. I have picked up a copy of the film on Blu-ray, so I look forward to watching that and lining up my thoughts on Moonlight, in a little bit of greater depth than I have previously. Or I haven't really gotten into it much at all, so looking forward to sharing my in-depth thoughts on that, rather than just giving you the surface level. Anyway, that'll be the end of this episode. If you can find more reviews, podcasts, videos, other movie-related goodies on crookedtable.com. I'm toying with getting back into the video side of things. I know it's been quite a while, almost a year, in fact. Like 10 months. And actually, X-Men Apocalypse, I believe, was my last one. So this felt like it would have been a good film to return to the video format on there, but I really want to make sure I get it right before I start doing video reviews or any kind of video content, especially since there's such a high level of content out there on YouTube, where people really get in depth and break things down, and I don't want to throw my hat in that ring unless I feel like I have something interesting to say, I guess is where I'm at with that. As far as podcasts, it's easy to just go on and on about an hour for a film that I really have a lot to say about. But to boil that down into like a 3 or 4 minute, like, this is the movie, and this is what I thought, and that doesn't really appeal to me as much. I'd rather talk at length about it for an hour, and I don't want to make an hour-long YouTube video. That seems a little crazy. So you can also find Crooked Table on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter at Crooked Table. I'm going to try and get a Moonlight episode up in the next week or two. But if you want any indication of whether or not I enjoyed that film, it is listed in my Best of 2016 post that I just put up on the site. I know it's better late than never edition, so at least I'm acknowledging that it's March and I'm posting that. But still, so go ahead and check that out. And if you haven't seen Moonlight, it's on Blu-ray. Watch that between now and the next episode, so that you can get into my spoiler-filled discussion on that next time. So I guess that's all I got for now, and catch you guys next time with Moonlight. And until next time, roll credits.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
CROOKED.